One of the things that's interesting about the Johnston farm is most everything that we talk about here happened right where we are. This is where a lot of early Ohio history took place, and we're going to talk about one segment of that today. One of Johnston's jobs was a federal Indian agent. So he represented a native population to the government, and then he had to turn around and represent the government to the native population, and really neither side cared for the other. So you're talking about a man who really was a true politician and did it very well. One of the people that Johnston interacted with quite a lot right here, he was appointed Indian agent for Western Ohio, and one of the groups that he dealt with were the Shawnee Nation. And today we've got with us Chief Blackhoof, who was the elder chief of the Shawnee Nation. And Blackhoof lived to be quite an old man, reputedly to be 111 years old. Today, the chief is going to tell about his story, his time as a youth, and also a little bit about the Shawnee culture. So, welcome, Chief Blackhoof.
Wahewa, Ketakawata, Wakanakwa, Machamanise, Bia. Hello. What I first said was, since I realized you do not understand Shawnee, was, what do you want? What did you come to hear? Have you ever heard of Katahakasa, the Blackhoof? Your talking leaves talk about the warrior Tecumseh. And they call him a great patriot. He fought for the British. But they say very little about Blackhoof. Blackhoof was the primary chief of the Shawnee during the same time period. Yes, I fought against the whites. I fought against the English. I fought against the Americans. Bitterly sometimes. But my life followed a different track than this Tecumseh did. And I will talk then a little bit about my life and how I got here, how I came to know Johnston, and how this was our land here. But you see, I have to take you back to a much earlier time. There was a time that these people did not have a name that we know of. And they lived far to the south. They lived where the weather was always warm. And they had a village that was led by two brothers. Kichokima, great chiefs. And they were very happy where they were at. And they raised crops and they hunted wild game. And the living was easy and it was good. But you see, a larger nation moved in near them. And they began to conduct warfare on them. And they would capture their young people and take them away. And they would take their women and they would take the young men and they would torture them. And so you see, these people came to these two brothers, these two chiefs. And they said, you must take us away from this place. Take us to a place where we can once again live happy and where the living is easy, where the game is plentiful. And so the brothers got together and they said, well, then let us build boats in this great blue salt water that lies to the north, towards that star that does not move in the sky. Let us build the boats and float across that water. And then perhaps we shall come to a land where we may be happy. Well, half the people objected and they said, no, we are afraid of this great blue water. Let us go with the other brother and we will walk towards the setting sun. And when we have gone far enough to get around that water, then we will turn towards the star that does not move in the sky. And perhaps we will get to a land that is safe and is a good land for us also. So you see, the nation split into two parts. And part of them built the boats, the Allagasha, or the Misha Allagasha, large boats. And they floated across the blue water. And pretty soon they could make out on the horizon, after many days of floating, a white line that laid across the horizon. And as they got closer, they realized that it was white sand. And so they came into this shoreline, and they came ashore, and it was a pretty good land. And some chose to stay in the vicinity of that blue salt water. And others said, no, we will move on further to the north and look for better farmland. And so they began to walk. And after many days of walking and looking at the land and scouting the wildlife, they came to another blue water, a Skipakesipe. This was fresh water. And it was deep also. And they said, we are going to have to build boats again. And so they began to construct rafts and boats, and they were going to float across this water. But you see, while they were building the boats, a group of warriors came up on the other side of the river, on the other bank. And they began to shout at them and to wave their weapons in the air. And they would cry out their war cries. And of course, the men on this side of the river, they're not going to put up with that. So they shook their weapons in the air and they screamed at them also. And after this had gone on for a bit of time, they began to shout insults back and forth. And then they realized, we can understand the insults. They're speaking the same language. You see, the other brothers group had found another way across the river, and they were the ones on the other side. So you see, these people came back together again. Now, perhaps there is a lesson in this story. Perhaps it says that maybe sometimes we should listen carefully first before we take action. And so these people came back together, and they came to be known as the Shawano, the southern people. I am a Shawanagi. I'm a southern man. So you see, while the one group that decided to stay close to the salt water, while they were there, they built a village. And this village was led by a chief. And he was a wise leader. And he led these people for many years. But he and his wife had no children. So they went to the village shaman and they said, what shall we do? Because we would like to have a son. We would like him to follow in his father's footsteps and to lead his nation, or at least to be a great warrior and a great hunter. And maybe he will earn his place to become a great chief. And the shaman said, go back to the village and be patient. You will have a child and you will have a son. So after a time, his wife became pregnant, and they did have a son. But you see, the young man, after he was born, became sick, and it looked like he would die. And so once again, they go to the village shaman, and they say, what shall we do with this young boy? Because it looks like he's going to die, and he will never have the opportunity to follow in his father's footsteps. And the shaman said, do not worry. Take him out into that blue salt water and dip him beneath the waves 3 times. And so they did so. They took him out into the salt water and they dipped him beneath the waves. Nagote, Neshwa, Natise, 3 times. And they brought him back to the village. And he became well and healthy. And he grew up strong. And he could run and walk large distances without tiring. And he was a great hunter and warrior. And it was said that his eye never failed, even into his old age. He said, what shall we name this boy? And the shaman said, name him Kata Hakasa, the Black Hoof. And so you see, today you have the Black Hoof standing before you. Now my people in this village formed one of the divisions of the Shawano. of the Shawnee tribe, the Shawnee nation. And we were many. 5 divisions that would come down through history. The Makoche, my division, you would call it a sept. The Chalagatha, the Thawagila, the Kispoko, and the Pickaway. And you see each division had their responsibilities. My division, the Makoche, provided the wise men, the counselors, the advice on health, and sometimes they would provide a primary chief. But mostly the primary chiefs came from the Chalagatha. And we would name our villages after our divisions. So you see today, you would probably think Chalagatha sounded more like Chillicothe. And Pickaway became Piqua. And these villages were situated many times in pairs. So near the village of Pickaway, which is near that town today you call Springfield, not here. There was a village also called Kispoko, or as the white men would refer to it, Kispoko Town. And the reason that they would situate the villages like that was so that when you came of age and you wanted to court a young lady, you weren't courting your cousin. So many times, either there would be 2 Shawnee divisions with villages near each other, or perhaps there would be a Mingo village, or Delaware, or Lenape, and so on, here in this Ohio country. But before we got to the Ohio country, we migrated through the southeast. And first through that place you call Tennessee. And they would come to this river that I spoke of that was blue, and called it the Skipakesipe, the blue water. But then they would say, well, where shall we cross it? And see, that other group that came up said, there's a place you can wade across. You do not need to build your boats. Go towards the rising sun till you find a large sycamore tree. Now, the sycamores in those days were much bigger than you see sycamores today. But even today, they sometimes have large hollow spots in the middle. It is said that during my time, a man on a horse could ride inside some of these sycamore trees. And this particular sycamore tree that marked the crossing across the river had a makahoke on it. Now, makahoke in my language means a large bump on the side of the tree. I'm sure you've seen those. And so they would say, go till you come to the makahoke and cross the river there. And soon the river became called the Makahoke. The Makahoke Sipe. But as always, the white men decided that name was not good enough, so they called it the Cumberland. And so my people stayed for a time in the area of the Cumberland. And they would follow it on up into a place that we named the head of the river, the Kentucky. Now later on, that man called Boone would say this land called Kentucky is a land that has no one in it. It is there free for the taking. It is a land rich in game, a good place to build farms. All we have to do is move in and clear the land. But you see, there were people there. Where else would he have gotten the Shawnee name, Kentucky? And so we followed the rivers up into Kentucky and we established villages there. And one in particular that I lived in was called Eskapakathiki. And the translation of Eskapakathiki again refers to the blue water. And in this case, it talks about how it was salty tasting also. And you today call it the Blue Licks. And so we lived in the Blue Licks for quite a long time. Up until the time that the white men began to come over the mountains, first in small numbers. And you see, the man Boone He would go back and tell his people about this rich land that laid west of the mountains. And he would seek to bring them over. Now, I do not fault Boone. Boone was a brave man. I think the people who followed him may even have been braver, because they knew nothing about what lay west of the mountains. They did not know this Boone very well. For all they knew, they were following him to their deaths. How bad must their lives have been where they were that they would follow this man into the unknown on just the promise that there was a better life there? And so you see, they came over the mountains looking for a better life, looking to establish themselves in a place that held promise, not realizing that there was a culture already there. There were families, there were children, we were farming. The game was very plentiful. Now, the way the white man looked at game was, once he established farms, the game competed with the farm for the land. And so to solve that, he would kill the game instead of just harvesting as much as he needed. And so you see, our people were looking at the land two different ways. Now, in these villages, the women were the farmers. The women owned all the personal property. The women would decide where the plots for the corn were to be and where they would plant the three sisters. How many of you know what the three sisters are? And beans. Do you have sisters at home? Do you have brothers at home? Do you share the chores in the house? I will tell you a story. We call them the three sisters because we first plant the corn in the mound in the field. And I say we, the women and the children. And when the corn begins to grow, it reaches the height of my knee. And when it reaches that height, we plant beans next to it, and the beans have a place to climb around the corn stalk. And once the beans are established, then we plant the squash or the pumpkins. How big are the leaves on a pumpkin plant? They cover the ground, and the grass cannot grow. So you see, because the three sisters help each other, they all grow better because of it. So you see, if you and your brothers help each other, you'll all do better because of it too. And so they raised the three sisters. And the women had many decisions in our nation. They would decide where to set up their houses, our wigwams. They owned all the goods inside. When we began to trade with the white men, many times my woman would do the trading because she was a better negotiator than I was. If I wished to use a cooking pot, I had to ask her permission because it belonged to her. If we were fortunate enough to have traded for an axe to cut wood, I would have to ask her permission because it belonged to her. The only thing in the household that belongs to me is my weapon, my blanket, and my tomahawk, and the clothes I wear. So you see, she had a lot to say about the decisions in our life. If the men decide to go to war, they will meet in the council house. And as they are wont to do, they would beat upon their chests and they would tell about the brave deeds that they would do. But before they went out the door of the council house and strike the war post with the butt of their rifle, their pimahiatake, or their takiwa, their musket, or their tekhawk, which you call tomahawk, they would invite several of the elder women into the council. And the women had the final decision. You would call it the veto. And they could decide whether or not they went to war. For if we go to war and I do not come back, who suffers? The women and the children. And so it would be their decision whether or not to go. In my nation, sometimes women might be a chief. We had women who fought as warriors. Have you heard of Halima, the warrior woman? In those days, they called her the warrior squaw, not a term we use today. 6 feet tall. So you see, if you go to the coast where the colonies were in 1774, and you ask the women there, can you vote? No. Can you own property? Can you own business? Can you conduct business negotiations? I think my nation was much more progressive than yours. Or maybe at some point your nation learned from mine. So you see, there were differences, not all bad, between our peoples. And the whites continued to pour across the mountains. And Boone came and they established villages, and we would fight. And the Cherokee told the English that they would sell Kentucky to them. Now the Cherokee did not have possession of Kentucky, but the English said, that sounds good to us. They gave them the money, and they started to move into Kentucky. And the warfare became so bad, and we fought on, and finally there was a treaty held, and it was decided that the whites would remain east and south of the river, the Skipake-Sipe, the Spele-Waithipe, the Big Turkey River. And if the Indians would remain to the north and to the west, problem solved. We would not fight anymore. And so you see, we agreed to that. We gave up the land of Kentucky and moved into this land called Ohio. You see, when we had lived in Kentucky, before the white men came, we noticed that blaze marks began to appear on the trees. Do you know what a blaze mark is? A white man takes his axe, much bigger than my Teckock, and he chops the bark away on a tree so that a white spot shows, and it will show down through the forest for many steps. And he will start with one tree and put the blaze mark on it, and he will walk maybe for several days towards the star that does not move, and he will blaze another tree. He will turn towards the rising sun and walk again, blaze another tree, turn towards the south, walk again, and blaze the fourth tree. Then he goes to a place he calls the land office. In Kentucky, it was in Frankfort, Kentucky. He goes into the land office and they get out their talking leaves. And they flip to a blank one. And they draw a picture of what he describes as where he just blazed the trees. And it represents the land that he just walked around. And he says, this is now my land. It belongs to me. And you Indians, stay out. How can you own land? Land was put here by the Creator for us all to use. It's the same as the air you are breathing. It's the same as the water you drink. I think that someday a white man will try to sell you that water. And they were not all seeking to own the land to farm it. Some wanted merely to own it for a short time and then sell it for more money, which you call land speculators. So you see, our cultures looked at the very land that we lived on differently. And then the blaze marks began to appear north of the Spele-Waithipe. The Big Turkey River, you call it the Ohio today. The French called it La Belle Rivière. But we were happy in Ohio, and we reestablished our villages. And once again, we would use those village names: Chalagatha, Pickaway, Kispoko, and Makoche. You've changed that name too. You refer to the Makachee castles. Not so named because some Scotsmen lived there, but because the Makoche villages were there. Wapatomica, you might call it our capital city. That is where we were going to take Kenton. We began to see those blaze marks on this side of the river. And once again, we knew we were going to have to fight for this land. Now the white men began to fight amongst themselves. Once they had fought between those two groups that called themselves the French and the Inglés. And they called it the French and Indian War. Not because the French and the Indians fought each other, but because those groups fought the English. I went to a river in Pennsylvania called the Monongahela. I led a small group of warriors that included my brother. His name was Yellow Hawk. And we went and joined with the Iroquois. Now, we did not particularly care for the Iroquois nation either. They sought to sell Ohio to the English, once again without actually living here. There are some seats right over here in the middle. But we joined with the Iroquois and the French because the English were marching up this river valley. They were marching in nice, neat lines with red coats on and crossed white belts. To a warrior with a pima hiatake, a rifle, a crossed white belt makes a very good aiming point. We shot them down like birds. And they began to fall, and they began to panic, and they ran back through their lines. They did not know that our numbers were far fewer than theirs, because we fought from the forest and they could not see us. And there was a drover who cut his horse loose from the harness and freed him from the wagon and rode his horse back through the crowd of fleeing men. His name was Boone, and he would escape the battle. He knew how it was going to turn out. And the general named Braddock was trying to form his troops up, but then he was shot down. And in the back of the line of troops were a group of men in blue coats, led by a man who also wore a red coat and was seated on a large white horse. And he was rallying those troops in the blue coats. And I said to the warriors around me, that man may turn the tide of the battle. He must die. And so you see, I loaded my rifle again, and I waited until he rode close by. And as he did, I took aim. Bang! He did not fall. Now, I could not understand this. As the shaman promised, my eye was sharp all my life. I was a great shot with both a bow and arrow and a rifle. So I loaded again. And I shot a second time, and he did not fall the second time. And I shot a third time, and he still did not fall. And I turned to my warriors and I said, the Creator has put this man on earth here for a reason. He has yet to do something of importance in his life. And so you see, the leader of the Shawnee Nation in the future, would survive that battle, and so would the leader of the United States, George Washington. For the Creator had a reason for us both. We chose poorly in that war. The French lost. The English won. They met and had treaty talks, and they would decide who stayed and who would have to go. But did they invite the red nations to those treaty talks? No. We were never conquered, and yet we had to deal with these victors, those who now felt that they had free pass to cross the mountains. And we continued the conflict. And then the white men would begin to fight amongst themselves again. And they would come to us and they would say, these other white men mean you no good. They wish to take your land. We just want to trade with you. Side with us. We will feed your women and children. They will no longer have to farm. I think you would call us mercenary soldiers today. We were paid to fight for the English, those who called themselves the British. The British 8th moved in with us in the village of Pickaway, that place that is near what you call the town of Springfield. And they encouraged us to raid Kentucky. They said, if you raid Kentucky, you take prisoners, sell them to the British in Detroit. It will discourage them and they will quit crossing the Spele Waithepe and they will leave you alone. But you see, it did not work that way. The soldier that you call George Rogers Clark, we call him the Shimanisa, the long knife. He was in that place called Vincennes, and he came back to the Kentucky country and said, I will put a stop to these Shawnee raids in Kentucky. I will burn their villages north of the river. I will burn their corn crops. And he brought 175 of his regular troops that he called the Illinois Regiment with him. And when they got to Frankfort, he asked for volunteers. He wanted to fill out an army of 1,000 men. But you see, no one would volunteer. They were too busy putting in land claims and speculating. And so Clark said, I will fix this. He posted 2 guards at the door to the land office and closed it down. He got his 1,000 men. And then he marched to the river, near a place that you today call Cincinnati. And he crossed the Spele Waithepe, and he marched up the valleys of the Checamiame Sipe and the Shimamiame Sipe. You call them the big and great Miami, or the little and the great Miami rivers today. And he went first to a town called Chalagatha, near a place you today call Xenia. And when he got there, there was no one there. Now, Clark will tell you that his arrival was a great surprise to the Shawnee. But you see, I had spies watching him from the time he crossed the Ohio River. And they would report to me each day. And I told the people in Chalagatha to clear out. Go north to the Makoche towns. And we will fight with Clark. And they burned the village of Chalagatha. And that night it rained all night. And in the morning their rifles and their muskets were wet and would not fire. So they had all the men draw the loads from their muskets, put in dry powder, and they all lined up in the morning. And when their officers shouted, "Fire!" they all fired at once. And it dried their muskets out. and their horses pulled their pickets and ran off through the forest. So they spent most of the rest of the day chasing their horses through the thickets. Do you really think that me and my men were surprised when they arrived at the Athene Sipe, the Mad River? And I had stationed my men all along in the cornfields on the north side of the river. As Clark approached, they came under fire from my men, and they thought there were many more than there really were. For you see, I only had 300 warriors. I had sent everyone else in the village north to the Makoche towns. And we would hold them off for a time, and then I would line my men up in formation as the British did, and march across the field and fire one volley and retreat back past the fort and into the forest and gone. Would declare a great victory. But you see, we lived to fight another day. But the British had failed me. For where were the King's Eight? That group of British regulars who had lived with us in the village. When they heard Clark was coming, they went to Detroit. First failure. Later on, they would fail me again. After this Revolutionary War was over, we would fight on. A series of border wars, still over ownership of the land. We would fight at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. At the Battle of Fallen Timbers, even though we had previously defeated Generals Harmar and St. Clair, inflicted the greatest losses on the U.S. Army for many years. At the Battle of Fallen Timbers, we ran into a general named Anthony Wayne, the man who never sleeps, the man who drills his men constantly. This was a different kind of general. And my men were defeated there under the great war chief Blue Jacket. And they retreated towards the British Fort Miamis, near what you call Perrysburg, Ohio, knowing that the British would take them in and protect them. The British locked the gates, and my men were forced to run on to the north. Failure number 2. So you see, when we were called to Greenville to meet for the Treaty of Greenville, I said there has to be a different way to deal with these people. Unlike the warrior Tecumseh, who would not even come to the talks, I was 48 years older than him. I had seen my young men die in battle, while the whites just continued to pour across the mountains. I had seen my women and children starve. I had seen them unable to build villages because we were constantly having to move to stay out of the way of the armies that came for us. I said there must be a different way to deal with them. I had that treaty read to me in Greenville. It said 2 things to me. Number 1, it said, we will throw our hatchets into the sea. We will never again raise them against these people who now call themselves Americans, who call themselves the United States. But it said something else. It said, now myself and my people belong to this country. We are citizens of the United States. And as such, the United States will stand by us, and if need be, we will fight for them. So you see, when the time came later to pick sides again, unlike the warrior Tecumseh, I would choose to go with the United States. Myself and my 500 Shawnee warriors. And we would guarantee that while the men were away to war in this Ohio country, If Tecumseh and his warriors and the redcoats came south from the lakes, my warriors would stand in for them, and we would fight for this country. And I provided spies, you call them scouts, to the armies of Harrison. I would go to Washington and would speak with your white father, Jefferson, now my white father. And I will say, we will accept this concept of property. Establish some reservations in Ohio. Give us Indian agents who are honest, like Johnston, who will deal fairly with us. And give us 3 things in our villages. Give us a sawmill, a grist mill, and a blacksmith. And we will learn how to be farmers again. And we will be good citizens and good neighbors. And we will raise farms and livestock. And we will be loyal citizens of this country. And Jefferson told me, as long as the rivers flow and the grass grows, you will be allowed to remain in the land of your ancestors. Now there's more to my story, and perhaps someday you will have the opportunity to hear the other part. But in the meantime, think about this. Have we remained true to that promise that your Jefferson made? And have you learned something from the talk today? Because you see, instead of the talking leaves that I spoke of, our history is passed on from elders to young people in stories, much as I have told you today. You live here in this country where my ancestors are buried. You are a culture that belongs to this area. You've now heard the stories, and it is up to you to pass those stories on. Thank you for coming out today.